Mali is a very good case to look at because there's a rather clear connection between historical grievances and present-day terrorism, which is that the Tuareg of the north of Mali, nomadic pastoralists of the north of Mali, they kept themselves separate from the rest of Mali through much of the colonial period. They didn't really participate, and they were told by the French administrators when decolonization was happening in the early 60s that they would be not part of Mali but part of a political entity to be created in the Sahara, taking the Tuareg areas of several countries. That didn't happen, leaving the Tuareg slightly out on a limb when independence came. There was a rebellion, a Tuareg rebellion, that was savagely put down by the Malian government, using a lot of Russian help, in fact. So there were Russian planes with Russian pilots napalming Tuareg families in the desert, 62, 63. The rebellion was put down very violently, but the Tuareg have never forgotten that, and there have been several rebellions since. And that offered a perfect template for Islamic fundamentalists to come in and to take on the Tuareg grievances and to fight partly in the Tuareg name. And the Tuareg very foolishly went along with that in 2013. And as a result, the Tuareg and the ACME, the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, fought together until the Tuareg realized what a terrible mistake they had made and withdrew, and are now, most Tuareg are very against the ACME people. There are some Tuareg who cooperate with them still, but that violence has clear origins in the rebellion and it's the savage way that it was put down in 1962. There's a straight line connecting those two events, and you can't understand present violence without understanding that.
And Mali history is a very tormented one. Of course, like the present insurgencies are themselves rather complex because they combine an aspiration towards separatism, and at the same time you have jihadist groups that are also operating in the same space. So you definitely need to go back into history to understand why these two insurgent movements coexist in the same space and have not exactly the same enemies, but they at least confront the central authorities in some ways. Not exactly in the same way, but in some ways. So originally, historically, the first wave of insurgencies was really much about separatism, or at least greater autonomy for the northern regions of Mali, largely because you have all sorts of structural imbalances between the north and the south. The power is concentrated in the south, and the northern elites felt disenfranchised and were really much behind the first waves of insurgency immediately after decolonization in 1960. The thing is that the state has not been able to manage this descent, and has even contributed to exacerbate this descent, and which leads to the present situation, which basically corresponds to the fourth wave of separatist rebellion. So there was one in 1963, another one in the 90s, another one in 2006, and the latest one started in 2012. But at the same time, and that's why Mali is such a complex case, since 2012 we see jihadist movement, very powerful, that also operates in parallel with the separatist movements.
The research is interesting partly because it is about Mali, but also it compares Mali to other situations. It's not just about Mali, and I think that's valuable. The main conclusion I would take from this work is that you have to look at the history of violence in marginal areas, in insurgent areas like the north of Mali, which is an extremely remote place. You have to look at what's happened in these places, and you'll find layer upon layer of violence, finishing up with a sort of ISIS type situation, which is my fear is where Mali might go. But you can't just fight that top layer. You've got to make your way down to the very bottom layer, which is the process of decolonization and how it was handled and the mistakes that were made. And you've got to attend to those grievances if you've got any hope at all in solving the others. Now there are several other layers on top of that until you get to present day violence, but you've got to solve and address those grievances, otherwise you haven't got a hope of dealing with it.
The very interesting aspect of this research on insurgent margins is that it sort of recontextualizes a phenomenon that is seen as a sort of transnational threat. So it places back these insurgencies within their national context. And by doing so, it forces us to look at what the state has done in the past. And so it's a way to sort of pay more attention to the historical elements that have contributed to the marginalization of some groups within these countries. And it fundamentally questions the forms of governance that have prevailed historically. So to me that's the kind of strong appeal for this kind of research. But the research does slightly more than this. It just doesn't talk about grievances. It also talks about interactions among communities in the periphery. Because of course one way for the state, and that resonates really much with the cases I know in Mali and Niger, one way for the state to manage a sort of marginalized periphery is to play some kind of divide and rule tactics, and to sort of foster rivalries among communities from the periphery. And that contributes to make these insurgencies and these wars particularly nasty and violent. And I mean, that's the big worry I have right now about Mali. It's in the parochialization of the rebellion. And this aspect of the rebellion is really much linked to the way the state has handled the periphery in the past. So to me it's much more important to focus on these things right now than to focus on counter-terrorism, for example.
There's a template for them to take action, which is the agreement which was signed in Algiers in March. There have been several agreements, all of them saying roughly the same thing, that have been signed previously, and they've never been kept to. They've never been followed for very long, and that's the case of this one. Nothing seems to have happened. So what the Tuareg are demanding for, well, they're not all demanding the same thing. They're obviously different Tuareg demands, but the majority Tuareg demand is, I think, is for some sort of autonomy, sort of Devo Max type autonomy, where they are responsible for most of the functions of government in a territory of their own. That's been conceded by the Malian government, but they do nothing about it, so it doesn't move forward. I think that as a first step would be enormously important. And at the same time, the Malian army has to stop murdering women and children and innocent civilians, which it's very good at. It's not very good at fighting off Islamic fundamentalists, but it's very good at murdering women and children, and it's done a lot of that. And that means that the resentment goes on. It's not just a historic grievance, it's a resentment that continues. If they stop doing that and they did the things that were contained in the Algiers Agreement, then I think that there would be some hope of moving forward.
The takeaway message from a normative perspective would be really much to start building peace from below by trying to reconnect communities that have their own diplomatic tools to deal with division and to settle their own to adjudicate their own disputes, right? But the thing is that these tools are very, very fragile, and if you impose on them some massive messages, or if you decide to lead massive counter-terrorism campaigns, you just destroy these local diplomatic capacities, and you really undermine the chance for lasting peace. So the kind of action that is definitely needed is an action from below, consisting in reconnecting divided communities at the very local level, and at the same time trying to adopt a sort of light touch approach to transformation of systems of governance at the central level. That's a complex message, but you have to deal with this complexity to make hopefully things happen.